This is PowerPoint lecture 1.3 for Survey of Economics on basic supply behavior. In this PowerPoint, we'll be going over the law of supply, supply schedules and curves, determinants of supply, shifts in supply curves, the idea of marginal analysis and diminishing marginal returns. We'll look at the production function, and finally, we'll do an analysis of profit maximization and how the profit maximizing level of production is calculated. Now, first, the law of supply. You'll see that the law of supply from PowerPoint lecture 1.2, we got the law of demand. You'll see that the law of supply here is diametrically opposed to the law of demand. And that gives us a certain amount of advantage here, because what that means is that whatever we say of demand, the opposite will be true of supply. This is due to the opposition of the law. And as you see, what we propose here is a positive correlation between price and quantity, meaning that as price goes up, the quantity supplied will go up. Another way of phrasing that is, the more you give me, the more you give me, the more I'll produce. Now, from that we derive the supply schedule that you see over here, and you see it's consistent with our law. And again, we're proposing a linear relation here. We have weekly supply of lawn mowing services. And you see that we propose a linear relationship here. Of course, supply is typically not linear. And I'll actually make mention of that. It's not terribly important to us, but I'll make mention of why that's the case. It has to do with marginal cost and how a supply curve is derived ultimately. But for now, we'll just simplify it. And you see that for $10, they'll provide they'll cut 5 lawns at $10 each. If you give them $20, they'll cut 10. If you give them $30, 15, and so on. And you see a linear relationship here. And you see it's consistent with our law of supply. As you give more and more, as the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. From that is derived the supply schedule. Now, the supply schedule is simply a graphic illustration of this, and you see it flows directly from our supply schedule over there. We see our supply curve. Quantity of 5 at $10, quantity of 10 at $20, quantity of 15 at $30, quantity of 20 at $40, and then finally a quantity of 25 at $50. And this is derived directly from the schedule. And you should be able to, if you're given this, you should be able to derive the schedule. And if you're given a schedule, you should then be able to derive the graph of the function. Now, probably our most important determinant in supply. Okay, we went over in 1.2 the determinants of demand and what determines a demand curve and what determines demand for a product. We're going to do the same thing here with supply. And when we deal with the determinants of supply, probably the single most important is the costs of production. So we want to go over those with some detail. Okay, now what we're talking about here is factor costs. And if you can recall from our original discussion from back at 1.1, I think it was, we talked about the various factors of production. And there were 4 factors of production. There was land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. Okay, those are our factor costs. Now, we break these factor costs into 2 categories. There are costs that are variable, and there are costs that are fixed. The very simple way of determining the difference between them is that you should probably be sitting down for this. This is going to be tough to grasp, I suppose. But at any rate, variable costs vary. Why they're called variable costs. Fixed costs are fixed. That's why they're called fixed costs. Now, that's true in short-run production. Okay, so variable costs are going to change with the level of production. Fixed costs are going to stay the same regardless of the level of production. And we think about this on an individual level. Okay, variable costs, okay, vary depending on what you do. Okay, so for example, okay, if you look at the gasoline that you put in your car, that's a variable cost. If I don't drive my car, I don't have to put any gas in it. All right. Whereas a fixed cost is something that you're going to have to pay whether or not you use it. Okay. Typical examples of this are mortgages, rents, loan repayments. They don't want to hear about changes in your income level. All they care about is give me the money. It's kind of like Joe Pesci in Goodfellas, show me the money, show me the money, right? And that's kind of what we deal with fixed costs. When we deal with production, fixed costs largely are for capital goods, mortgages on land, things like that. Variable costs, your main variable costs are going to be your intermediate goods, primarily any intermediate goods that go into the production of a thing. For example, coal. Coal is an intermediate good that goes into the production of steel. And your laborers are going to be a variable cost. If we don't produce anything, we don't have to hire anybody. Okay? If we don't produce any steel, we don't have to buy any coal. So that cost is going to vary with production levels, whereas fixed costs are not going to vary. Okay? So in other words, if we borrow money, okay, to build a steel mill, okay, and put all the capital equipment in that we need for that steel mill, whether or not we're producing steel, we've got to make the payment on that loan, okay? And so that's a fixed cost. Total costs then is the summation of your variable costs that vary with your production level and your fixed costs, okay? Total cost up, quantity supplied down. That's how our supply curve is going to shift. And we'll look at the shifts a little bit more specifically here. But the quantity supplied dropping, okay, a shift in the supply curve, a reduction in the supply curve is going to be an inward shift or an upward shift, whereas an increase is going to be a downward shift or an outward shift, okay? The same thing. And we'll take a look at that graphically in just a minute after we go over some of these. Now, the second determinant of supply is the number of producers. And that's fairly simple to understand. The more producers there are, the more is going to be produced at any given price level. Okay. And then the other one that's easy enough to understand is alternative production possibilities. Okay. Given our available resources, we have any number of production opportunities, okay, that we can put our resources into. What determines which one we're going to put our resources into is the profitability. I mean, when you go to college, okay, there are basically two motivations for choosing a major. One is because you like the subject, okay, you like it. Maybe you're not going to make much money at it, but you like it, okay. The other, and the more frequently used, is you take a look at the job markets, you do an analysis on that, you do some research, and you determine what the most profitable use of your time is going to be. Okay, so that's ultimately the reason that we go to college. Okay, if I'm looking at any number of career opportunities, any number of jobs that I want to have, okay, I could work at McDonald's for $7.15 or $7.20 an hour. All right, or I could become, a computer technician and make 60 grand a year. Okay, my desire is to go into the more profitable line of work. This is true for producers too. Okay, if I'm producing two things, let's say I have a choice, and I have any number of choices. I can produce anything under the sun. Okay, it all depends on what I want to use for resources. But if I have two, I'm going to produce widgets and I'm going to produce sprockets. That comes from the old Jetsons, right? You had Spacely sprockets and Cogswell cogs. Okay, so we're going to produce sprockets and cogs. Cogswell cogs, Spacely sprockets. We're going to produce those two things. The profitability of them determines which of those two I'm going to produce. Now, the next determinant of supply to go over is future expectations, what we expect is going to happen in the market. And we had something very similar to this when we were dealing with with demand functions. That, for example, if I was a consumer and I expected it that in the future prices would go up, I'll buy it now, okay, before that price increase takes place. Well, the effect of this is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, I expect the price of it to go up in the future, and so I want to avoid that, and so I buy it now. Well, by buying it now, that shifts the demand curve outward, and increases the price. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have a very similar idea with the supplier. Okay, now first, the future demand. All right, if I expect that demand is going to go up in the future, I will increase supply now to take advantage of that demand. The net effect of this is that my increase in supply now is going to shift the supply curve outward to the right, which will drop the price, which will increase demand for the good. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We see this in labor markets. Okay, I expect that the demand for nurses is going to go up in the future. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll train myself to be a nurse. So many people do this that the supply of nurses goes through the roof, and therefore the value of the nurse, the price of the nurse will go down, and you'll actually have an increased demand for it. Okay, so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The second is for future prices. Okay, another expectation that I'm going to have is future prices. If I believe the price for my product is going to go up in the future, I'll ratchet up production now to take advantage of that price increase. Now, the problem with this is this becomes a self-defeating prophecy. It becomes a self-defeating prophecy because I expect the price for my product is going to go up in the future. I ratchet up production now. That slides the supply curve outward, which has the net effect of reducing prices. Okay, and so it's self-defeating. We see this also in labor markets. All right, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, computers were relatively new. They were coming on. Everybody wanted to be a computer technician, programmer, etc., because they commanded, there were very few of them, and they commanded an enormous wage. Well, enough people glutted the market and went and got, training to be technicians and programmers and whatnot, that it massively increased the supply of them and dropped the price down. Okay, this is how, this is the invisible hand, so to speak. And 30 years ago, that was the case with computer technicians. Nowadays, that's the case with nurses, okay, because nurses command this enormous salary. The salary, by the way, that they command now is not what they commanded 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they commanded a much higher salary because healthcare was just expanding, just mushrooming out in its expansion, and there weren't enough of them. Now, it's starting to glut the market. Okay, so this future expectation of prices is going to determine where my resources are going to go. If I expect the price is going to be high in the future, I'm going to throw my resources into it now. Now, the final is the future expectations of costs. If I expect costs to go up in the future, okay, I'll increase my supply right now before that cost increase. Okay, so if in other words, I'm looking and I think, okay, I'm producing steel and I think coal in the future, 3 months from now, is going to ratchet up in price, I'll buy as much of it as I can right now and produce all my steel and hold an inventory of it so that I don't have to produce it after that cost increase. Well, this too becomes something of a self-fulfilling prophecy, all right? Because now we're dealing with a resource market, all right? If I expect that the price of coal in the future is going to go up, so I'm going to ratchet up my steel production now, that means my demand for coal is going to go up right now, and that's going to ratchet up the price. Now, a final note, and Schiller talks about this. All economists talk about this. We don't go over independently resource markets and labor markets and all that because they're like any other market. Okay, so once we have the basic principles, we can apply it to anything. This is true also when they discuss the idea of taxes and technology. Taxes and technology ultimately affect the cost of production. Okay, if you increase taxes, that increased the cost of production with the resulting effect on the supply curve. Okay, so too, if you have technological improvement that increases the productivity per worker, okay, that's going to reduce the cost. All right, so that's going to slide the supply curve outward. And so when you think about taxes and technology, you simply have to think about how they're going to affect the cost. Tax increases, increase costs. Tax decreases, decrease costs. Technological improvements, decrease costs. Technological, non-improvements, technological backwardness, will increase costs. If you reduce the amount of technology, it's going to increase your costs. So we don't deal with them independently. We just simply understand that they are going to affect the cost of production. Now, as we did with demand, we want to differentiate between movements along the supply curve and a shift in supply. The determinants that we just discussed, they're all shifts in the supply curve. They're going to move the position of the supply curve. When it comes to a price change, that's simply going to move along the supply curve. Okay? And a lot of students miss this idea. They think that when price changes, that's going to shift either supply or demand. It doesn't. That simply moves it along the curve. The shifts that we discussed here, the shifts that we previously discussed in 1.2 on demand, that shifts the curve entirely. That changes the position. Okay? And you see here this corollary, it's what I mentioned at the beginning here, is that since the law of supply is opposite of the law of demand, whatever was true of demand, the opposite is true of supply. And so, for example, when we shift demand, the price and quantity go in the same direction. If we increase demand, if we slide the demand curve outward, both price and quantity will go up. Well, if we do the same thing, if we increase supply, while the quantity will go up, the price will go down. Okay? So that just gives an example of what I was talking about with the opposition of those two laws. We see here what we're talking about shifts in the supply curve. A being an outward shift, B being an inward shift, A being an increase in supply, B being a decrease in supply. We have this here because this is the price of our product, okay? And so what this means is that for the same price, more will be produced. For the same price, less will be produced. So all those determinants we looked at, this is what they're shifting, okay? So for example, if the cost of production goes up, less will be supplied. If the number of producers producing the product go up, okay, for the same price, you'll have greater supply. This becomes especially important to us too. You kind of want to note this because this is going to become especially important to us when we go over international economics and international trade, because this is going to be the effect of foreign producers, of free trade. If we allow foreign producers into our market, that's going to increase supply. We're not dealing with the demand curve here. What we're ultimately going to do is have a demand curve right here and then discuss equilibrium and shifts in equilibrium and how all that works and how the market actually determines that. Right now, we're just talking about supply. We just want to start with the simple basics and look at what a supply shift looks like. Outward shift, increases in supply, all those determinants we talked about, that's going to increase it, that's going to decrease it. One of the more significant concepts that we're going to need to get down, okay, is the idea of diminishing marginal returns, and it's something that at least intuitively, we've all experienced diminishing marginal returns, okay? What it essentially means is that you gradually build up production to a maximum, and then it drops off. You see the technical definition, each unit of a variable resource added to a fixed resource increases production from the preceding point up to a certain point. Okay, and this is a term that I kind of come up with, is the idea of capital saturation. The reason is, okay, in the short run production, you have a fixed amount of capital equipment, machinery that can be used. Okay, well, as you add laborers to those machines, they ultimately increase productivity until you saturate all of your equipment. So for example, if we're running, let's say, a textile factory, okay, we're making clothes, all right, and our machinery is sewing machines, okay, and we're going to run this thing 24 hours a day, give all of our workers 8 hours of work. We add our first worker, he can use the sewing machine for 8 hours. We add another worker, he can use the sewing machine for 8 hours. We add a third worker, they can use the sewing machine for 8 hours. But if we add a fourth worker, what the hell's that fourth worker going to do? Okay, we've already saturated the equipment. The only way we can give him a job is by increasing by another sewing machine. Then he can work that one for 8 hours. Okay, So we're going to deal with this over and over, the production effect of capital equipment, okay? This is basically the idea, what we used to talk about in kitchens was this is the idea of too many cooks spoil the broth, okay? You have so many pieces of capital equipment in a kitchen, in a commercial kitchen. Okay, assuming you got one cook working each piece of capital equipment, you've saturated your capital. You hire more people, and then you get what we call redundancy. Okay, you have too many people working too little equipment. All right. We notice it now. What we mean by this is that as you add, so for example, think about for example if you study, okay, and I know most people don't study. No, most people do. It's very good. Okay, but you know, when you start out studying, it takes maybe 15 minutes, half an hour to really bring your concentration to bear. Okay, so production is gradually going up. Then you hit, you know, all cylinders, and you study and grasp a lot of information and do the best for maybe 2 hours, 3 hours. After that, the amount that you're actually learning begins to diminish precipitously. It goes down. Okay, which is why pulling an all-nighter to study for an exam never makes any sense. Okay, you're gonna actually learn material for the first maybe 3, maybe 4 hours, and then after that, you're just wasting your time. You're not going to learn anything. Okay, because you've hit diminishing marginal returns. This is a basic phenomenon that goes with the production or any activity. The longer you do it, the less valuable it is. We'll, you know, okay. The reason that diminishing marginal returns works the way it works is because of a concept known as the specialization of function. Okay, the easiest way to explain specialization of function and why it increases, okay, production per worker, per unit of a variable resource, up to a certain point, that point of capital saturation. The reason it does, the easiest way to explain it is by way of example. Okay, so the example I use, let's suppose that we own a bar restaurant. Okay, let's just suppose we own a tavern. All right, and we work it all by ourselves. We're the only person there, which means that when somebody comes in the door, when a guest comes in the door, we have to greet them, seat them, get them menus, get their drink order, make their drinks, then get their food order, make their food. We have to prep all of the food in advance. We have to order all of the food. We have to do all of our own accounting work. We have to do all of our own cleaning work. Okay? Well, as a result of that, you don't get much done. Okay? The production is not at its optimum. So what we do is we begin to specialize. Okay, so for example, in our example, what I'll do is I'll hire a bartender. Now I don't have to make anybody's drinks. That leaves me free, okay, to throw my resources, my time, into doing all of the other functions. But even still, I'm not producing enough. So what do? I hire a hostess. They greet the people and send them down. Then I hire a server. They get their orders, right? Then I hire myself a couple of cooks. I hire myself an accountant. I hire myself a cleaning service, or right. And so as I bring more and more laborers, variable resources onto the capital equipment that I have, each of them is able to produce more because they're specializing, they're focusing only on the one job that they're doing. And so as a result, they can do that job more efficiently. Okay, and this is the problem. Multitasking is for knuckleheads. Multitasking doesn't work. Okay, if you're multitasking, you're dividing your available resources, okay, among several different things. And as a result, you're not able to devote all of your focus and resource to one thing. This is the ultimate idea of the specialization of function. And we kind of know this, at least intuitively. I mean, the idea is that, okay, we go to college and we pick a major, and our major is based on what we're going to do for our career. Okay, so if we study, for example, nursing, or if we study whatever, computer technology, or if we study economics, okay, we're going to specialize in that. That's what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to trade for everything else that I need. Okay, this is why I don't do my own auto repair. I do a lot of my own home repair. I do a lot. I'm one of them do-it-yourselfers. So like I made a concrete sidewalk and things like that. So, okay. But that's just because it was fun and because it saved me a bundle of money. But at any rate, we specialize in one purpose. All right. That's what's going to create diminishing returns. Okay. That's what's going to increase productivity up to the point of capital saturation. And then afterwards, productivity will fall off. One of the other important things that we want to understand, and we dealt with it a little bit with demand, is the idea of marginal analysis. Marginal analysis is the increase in one variable based on a 1 unit increase in another variable. Okay? If we're really thinking about it technically, we talk about independent and dependent variables. Okay, and so what we're talking about here is the change in a dependent variable based on a 1 unit increase in an independent variable. Okay, and so when we talk about, for example, diminishing marginal returns, what we're talking about is productivity per unit of variable resources. How we measure this is we look at the change in overall quantity produced based on the addition of 1 unit of a variable resource. So we're dealing with, as you see here, the change in total quantity over the change in a variable resource. Now, kind of a technical note here, something that irritates me when economics textbooks do this, and you'll notice it in our textbook, okay? In symbolic logic, there's an inconsistency. In symbolic logic, when you select a particular symbol to represent a particular concept, only that symbol can represent that concept, and vice versa. Only that concept can be represented by that symbol, okay? And so too, when I take a when I take a concept and represent it with a symbol, that symbol and that symbol alone can be used for that concept. Otherwise, it creates inconsistency. One of the things that irritates me in economics is when economics textbooks start to talk about marginal quantity produced, they refer to it as MP, marginal product. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, it doesn't make any sense because up until now, from the introduction to an economics textbook, P stands for price. In all of these PowerPoints and all of our classes and everything, okay, we talk P is price, not P is sometimes price and sometimes we'll use it to refer to product. No, P is price. Quantity, from the very beginning, quantity refers to quantity produced. And so when we talk about marginal quantity, we're talking about the marginal quantity produced, the change in the total quantity based on one more variable resource, okay? Largely when we talk about variable resources, we're talking about laborers, okay? So we're talking about how much of our total change in quantity, okay, is the result of the next laborer being added, all right? Yeah, the text usually refers to it as marginal physical product. And so we simplify things by, one, maintaining consistency with our symbolic logic, and two, by referring to it as what it is, marginal quantity, all right? Here we have simple production function, okay? And we'll see now what we've been talking about. Here gives us an example. This is a variable resource added to production. These are laborers, quantity labor, okay? First laborer, second laborer, third laborer, fourth laborer. Each time we're adding one more laborer. Now you'll notice here, this is the total quantity produced. First laborer comes in and produces 2. When we add the second laborer, our total product goes up to 5. Third laborer, our total product goes up to 10. Fourth laborer, total product goes up to 18, and so on. From that, we can see what the marginal quantity is. Because the first worker comes in and produces 2, the addition of this worker increased this by 2. So his marginal quantity of production is 2. We add the next worker, okay, one more worker, our total quantity goes up to 5. So what was the marginal quantity produced by that additional worker, by the second worker? 3, the difference between these two. Next worker comes in, our total product now goes to 10. Well, what was the marginal product of that worker? The difference between these two, 5. Okay, next worker comes in, our total product now goes to 18. Well, what was the product of that worker? The difference between these two numbers. Okay, 8. And you'll note diminishing marginal returns. Each unit of a variable resource added to a fixed resource produces more than the preceding unit. Okay, this worker produced 2, this worker produced 3, this worker produced 5, produced 8, produced 10, up to some point after which it reduces, and we called that point the point of capital saturation. So what you should be able to do very quickly, without any technical calculation of any kind, is if you see a table that looks like this, okay, you should be able to first figure out what the marginal quantity of each worker is. That's very simple. You just difference those two numbers, all right? And then based on that, you look at the marginal quantity, you should be able to tell at a glance where the point of capital saturation is, where you reach the point of diminishing marginal returns, okay? Each worker produces more to a certain point, then they produce less. So our point of capital saturation is right here, when we've produced 55 units at the 7th worker, okay? From that point forward, each additional worker is producing less than the preceding unit, all right? Simple enough to understand, okay? And then this is the graph of it, and you'll notice the graph. This is total quantity. You'll notice how it flattens out at the top. It begins to flatten out once marginal quantity begins to diminish, okay? This is the marginal quantity. We rise up to the point of capital saturation. It then begins to diminish. Once it begins to diminish, this begins to flatten out. Now, if we continue to hire workers so that workers would actually be negative in their marginal quantity, then the total quantity would actually go down. And it's not ludicrous to think of this, okay? We may have had jobs where this is the case. We may have actually been that additional worker that reduced productivity. How does that happen? I'll tell you how that happens. You hire so many people that some of them, these workers down here, they probably never should have been hired in the first place, right? They don't produce very much. They're kind of lazy. Well, what do? Well, they distract all the other workers. They sit there talking with them, gossiping with them. That reduces their productivity. And so the productivity overall goes down. Okay? That can happen. If you hire too many workers, it can actually reduce your total overall production. Continuing on with costs of production. We now deal with average cost. Average costs are different than marginal costs. Average costs, very simply, are the total divided by the quantity produced. And so, look, for example, the big one for us is the average total cost. Total cost being what we talked about before, fixed and variable costs, fixed cost plus variable cost, divided by the quantity. That's your overall cost per unit. That's very different than marginal cost. Marginal cost is going to be your change in total cost based on the production of one additional unit. This is your cost per unit for the overall thing, okay? The difference between them is that this is going to involve average costs. And then you can break down into average fixed cost and average variable costs, okay? Because you have fixed resources, variable resources. And so that's your average cost. One way to explain the difference between average cost and marginal cost is think about you go buy a car. Okay, my mother-in-law just bought a car not too long ago. Bought a beautiful Audi A3, 34 grand. Okay, well, your average when you drive that car off the lot, your average cost per mile is your total cost divided by the total miles you've put on that car. So the first mile you drive off that lot, if you've paid $34,000, the average cost of a mile is $34,000. Okay, but when you put a second mile on that car, now you take the total cost, okay, which is your $34,000. Now you divide it by the second by the total quantity driven. Okay, ultimately, you buy a $30,000 car, you buy it 1,000 miles, that's $30 per mile. That doesn't include your variable costs, which is your gas and the depreciation of the car. All right, that's the idea. All right, you face your highest average cost with the production of the first unit because you're facing your fixed costs. Okay. We now deal with marginal cost, which is like marginal analysis of any kind. It's going to be your change in total cost as a result of producing one more unit. And this is going to be very important to us. In the next section, we're going to talk about profit maximization. And profit maximization, the basic rule is going to involve marginal cost, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But you see here, change in total cost resulting from the production of one additional unit, change in total cost, change in quantity, with that change in quantity being 1 unit. Marginal variable cost is the change in variable costs resulting from the addition of 1 unit. Don't really worry about that too much, okay? It's just to theoretically cross all the T's and dot all the I's on costs. All right, and now we see the costs table of the production function. And before we get too terribly intimidated by all these numbers here, let's just take a look at them and see that they're really a fairly simple model. And what we have here, let's look at the conditions. These are hourly costs, okay, for meals at a local restaurant. And what we're figuring is that the fixed costs, remember what we talked about with the fixed costs, they're indifferent to the amount that you produce. And they include, rents, mortgages, loans on equipment, things like that. Here it's, this includes a repayment of loans for capital equipment, which could include mortgage, buildings, etc. The laborers here are going to be uniformly paid $9 an hour. So, 1 laborer is $9, 2 laborers is $9 a piece. That's 18 bucks. And the ingredients for a meal are $10. Okay. So this guy produces 2 meals. His cost is going to be $9 for the laborer plus 2 meals at $10 a piece is $20 for a total variable cost of $29. And just kind of point of interest for your information in restaurant management. Typically what you think of, we're going to look at this model and we're going to play it through because this restaurant, as it works out, when we get to the profit maximization section, they don't make very much profit. And we'll look at the parameters of how you could try to improve that. And one of the things is that typically in a restaurant, what you think of as the price of a meal is 3 times the cost of the ingredients going into it. Okay, including the price of your labor. So, this guy's $9 an hour plus $20 in ingredients. That's plus $10 in ingredients rather. So at $10 an ingredient for the ingredients, you're going to charge $30, but that's neither here nor there. We're not going to get into that very much. This isn't after all, of course, on restaurant management. But at any rate, okay, so let's hire our first laborer. That's $9 for him. $20 for the meals he produces. That'll be a variable cost of $29, a total cost of $79. Why $79? Because your fixed cost is $50 an hour. Okay, so you see it's $50 the whole way down, regardless of production levels. And so that's going to be $79. All right, and then you take out the averages. You produce 2, and so there's your average fixed cost, 25 bucks a meal. And you just do the math on that. What you can do is just copy it down and do it in Excel. That's I created this table on Excel because I'm not going to sit here and do all this math by hand, and neither should you. And then finally, that brings us to the marginal cost, which is the change in the total cost right here, divided by the number of meals. And we might rest there for a second because if we look at this, here's our total cost, $118 with the second worker. We now have produced 5 meals. The difference between these two figures is $39, and you've produced 3 more meals for that $39, so that's $13 a piece. All right. Um, and again, I encourage you just kind of to look at this a little bit till you realize what's going on with the and they're very simple calculations. They all flow from the formulas we just did. From those tables, we can develop these cost curves. And we want to look at these just for a minute here, because you see that the marginal cost drops down considerably. And to come up with a simple example and this gives us, we want to look at the relationship between average and marginal. And you look at the relationship of average and marginal anything, average and marginal cost being here. But remember, a little while back, I came up with the example of an automobile. While it's true that if I buy a $30,000 automobile and I drive it off the lot, that first mile has cost me $30,000 plus the variable cost. Typically, they figure, I think they figure about 40 cents for the depreciation of a vehicle on the capital equipment, plus the gas cost, which is, let's say, a nickel. Okay, so plus that 45 cents, so $30,000.45 is your average cost of that first mile. But when you drive a second mile, you're ignoring the fixed costs, okay? Because they don't have anything to do with driving that second mile. And so when we deal with the marginal cost of that second mile, you're dealing only with the 40 cents in depreciation plus the nickel in gas. So you see that with the second laborer and the second, it drops considerably the marginal cost. Okay, and then marginal cost flattens out. It reaches this bottom point of capital saturation somewhere around our seventh worker, I think it was, and then it begins to rise. Now, what you're going to notice with the average total cost is as long as marginal cost is dropping, the average is dropping. But once marginal starts to go up again, then average is going to flatten up and then it will go up again. Technically speaking, we don't get into this. I mean, in microeconomics, we get into a lot more depth of this and a lot more detail of this. Typically speaking, when you look at a supply curve, the supply curve actually is the average total cost curve. Okay, we don't need to deal with that. That's why it's curvilinear. You might remember me mentioning that it's curvilinear. It's the average total cost curve, but we don't deal with that. Okay. And so if you think about it, let's think about an even simpler example. Let's say you've got let's use a football example. Let's use a running back. Okay, let's say a running back has carried the ball 20 times and has gained 100 yards. Okay, to do the math simply in my head, that's 5 yards per carry. Well, if on their next carry they gain 2 yards, that makes their total 102 in 21 carries. Okay, so that's now going to be less than 5 yards a carry. The margin has, if the margin is lower than the average, okay, it's going to lower the average, and that's what we have here. Once the margin gets above the average, then it's going to raise the average. Okay, and technically speaking, we'll get into this a little bit. We talk about it. I kind of slough off a little bit long run production. We're dealing mostly with short run production. In fact, so far that's all we've dealt with. But when it comes to long run production, remember the difference is that the difference between long run and short run is that short run production, your fixed resources are fixed. Okay, they can't change. But in long run production, you can increase them. There are all costs are going to be variable there. Everything's going to be variable. Technically speaking, the time for an expansion of a facility for increasing or changing the level of fixed resources is when average total cost reaches its bottom. Okay, because from that point forward, if marginal cost is rising, once average total cost reaches its bottom, because marginal cost is now going to be above average total cost, the average total cost will start to rise. And so that's when you want to try to change. But that's just kind of an aside. Now, this is the relationship, and you can kind of work this out. It makes perfect sense. The relationship between marginal cost and what we're calling marginal quantity, or the amount produced per worker. And you see, because of diminishing marginal returns, the amount per worker goes up. Okay, this is because this part, right? The amount per worker is going up because of the specialization of function. It reaches this point of capital saturation, then the marginal quantity per worker begins to go down, largely because of redundancy. past the point of capital saturation. And this is what we call diminishing marginal returns, is this part. Okay. Well, what you can see is as marginal quantity rises, marginal cost is going to drop. The point of capital saturation will be the same. And as marginal quantity begins to drop, the point of diminishing marginal returns, marginal costs will begin to rise. We'll now deal with the difference between a firm and an industry. And microeconomics deals with industries too, but not as much as macroeconomics. And we're on our way to macroeconomics. If you can remember, I said the difference between micro and macro is micro studies economics, the basic principles. It studies economics at the level of the individual firm, the individual consumer, the individual producer, etc. Well, now we deal with the difference between firm and industry. Firm is an individual producer. Industry is all of the producers given a product. And you can see here some examples. U.S. Airways and the airline industry, Hertz and the rental car industry, Walmart and the retail industry, U.S. Steel and the steel industry, General Motors and the auto industry. And in markets, in equity trading, these deal with sectors of the economy, so that you have the industrial sector, the materials sector. Okay, so they all lump together. We don't deal with them as much. But you can. Everything we're saying for the individual firm pretty much functions for the industry as well. But we deal with that a little bit more on the macro level. Okay, and now we deal now with short versus long run production. And I was just mentioning this. And the basic difference between them is that in short run production, the quantity and quality of fixed resources do not change. Everything we've talked about so far has been based on short run production. And I mentioned that the big difference between them is that in long run production, there are no fixed resources. You can change the amount of land, you can change the amount of capital equipment, anything that is not contingent on the amount you're producing can be changed in the long run. That is technically the difference between short run and long run. It's not a question of timing. Now, in macroeconomics, when we get to macroeconomics, short and run, long run really have a lot to do with arbitrary definitions of timing. Here they don't. These are technical definitions. If you can change fixed resources, you're in the long run. And typically speaking, the rule of thumb when you move from short run into long run, okay, the rule of thumb is you're going to alter fixed resources, either through investment or through getting rid of some of them when your average total cost curve reaches its bottom level. Okay, that's when you start to think about expansion or contraction. Okay, and that's what we call about here the investment decision. And we'll deal with investment a little bit more when we get to macroeconomics. Investment, technically speaking, is the purchase of capital equipment. Okay, capital equipment being any equipment that's used in the production of something else. And we'll deal with plant and productive capacity, and this is kind of important to look at. And again, we'll deal with this when we get to macro as well. See, that's one of the things. One of the things that's always kind of strange to me, and it's true with Robert Morris, is that they have macroeconomics as a lower level class than microeconomics. Okay, microeconomics is the basic economic principles that govern all economic relationships. Macroeconomics is an extension of that. So it's always like when I went to school, you studied micro first, then you studied macro, because macro is an extension of micro. And that's true here. Okay, when we deal with plant capacity, that's the potential production that an individual firm, by way of extension, an individual industry, by way of extension, the entire economy, how much it can potentially produce. Well, that's really a function of fixed resources, how much capital, labor, or how much capital and land you have. Productive capacity is how much you're actually producing. Okay? The maximum productive capacity that anyone can achieve is their plant capacity. Okay? And we'll deal when we get to macroeconomics and economic growth a little bit more with how you expand plant capacity, how you expand that potential production level. Okay? And so for the most part, most firms and most industries are producing suboptimally. They're not producing at their plant capacity. They're producing less than that, which is their productive capacity. At the down point in the late 1970s, the steel industry in the United States started to suffer a significant downturn. And at the lowest point by the early 80s, their productive capacity was a little bit less than 60% of their overall plant capacity, meaning that they were underutilizing all of the capital equipment and labor that they had. Okay.